Have you ever stared at the ceiling in the quiet dark, wondering if you'll ever get the one thing your heart aches for most? My name is Emily Carter, and for years, that ache was all I knew. I watched my friends post baby announcements and decorate nurseries, smiling for photos that seemed to belong to another world. My husband Jack and I tried everything: doctor visits, late-night prayers, old wives' tales whispered over herbal tea. Each month was a new cycle of hope and heartbreak until hope itself felt dangerous, almost like a trick my mind played on me. But when the test finally turned positive, I couldn't believe it at first. I held my breath with every ultrasound, every gentle flutter in my belly, worried that happiness would slip through my fingers again. We painted the smallest room in our house, a soft yellow, folding tiny socks and arranging storybooks on shelves. Jack would place his hand on my bump and sing silly songs, promising our little girl a life full of laughter. For the first time in so long, our home felt alive, echoing with dreams we hardly dared speak aloud. We decided to name her Grace because that's what she was to us, a miracle wrapped in hope after years of pain. Every day I'd sit by the window and write letters to her. I wrote about the strength I wished for her, the kindness I wanted her to know, the world I hoped to show her. Even when my back ached or I was too tired to move, I found myself humming lullabies, planning for a life where love would always be louder than loss. I'll never forget the first time I held Grace in my arms. She was so small, but her presence filled the room like sunlight. Jack wept openly, his head bent low against her tiny fingers. And in that moment, everything felt possible. The weight I'd carried for so long, the fear, the waiting, the unspoken sadness, suddenly seemed lighter. I made a silent promise to her that night I would be her safe place. No matter what came, I would always be her home. Sometimes happiness tiptoes in so quietly, you barely notice until it's woven into everything. Our days became a gentle rhythm of feeding, rocking, and watching Grace discover the world, one smile at a time. Friends sent cards and soft blankets. Neighbors dropped off casseroles. And for the first time, our little family felt complete. Jack would dance with Grace in the living room, laughing as she clung to his shirt, her tiny giggles chasing away every shadow that lingered in our past. Yet, in the midst of all this newness, I never forgot what it felt like to be alone and longing. I remembered the empty rooms, the hospital waiting areas, the moments when hope seemed so far away. That memory, bittersweet as it was, made every ordinary joy shine a little brighter. It taught me that sometimes the greatest gifts arrive after the longest waits, and that love can find us even after we think we've lost our way. If happiness can sneak in quietly, so can fear. One afternoon when Grace was just a few months old, I noticed her cheeks were too warm and her cries a little too thin. At first I told myself it was nothing babies get. Fevers, don't they? I bundled her in her favorite blanket, rocking her in the sunlit nursery, whispering that everything would be okay. But as the night stretched on, her fever rose, and each ragged breath became sharper, more urgent. We called the doctor, hoping for reassurance, but were told to come in just in case. My hands shook as I packed her diaper bag, trying to believe it was a false alarm. At the hospital, doctors moved quickly. Machines beeped, nurses murmured, and suddenly Grace was surrounded by wires, her tiny body almost lost in a sea of white sheets. I remember the cold chair beneath me as I sat beside her crib, counting each breath, clinging to Jack's hand and praying for a miracle. Hours blurred into days. Sometimes other mothers would pass me in the hallway, their faces etched with the same exhausted hope. In the waiting room, we traded gentle nods, a silent sisterhood forged in fear. I met a woman named Sharon, whose son had survived a similar scare, and she held my hand without saying a word. But hope can be fragile. After a week, as the morning sun crept through the blinds, Grace's tiny heart couldn't fight anymore. The world seemed to stop. I pressed my cheek against her soft hair, whispering all the love I hadn't had time to give, and let her go. There's no word for a parent who loses a child, and maybe that's because the pain is too enormous for language. For days I moved through life like a ghost, not eating, not sleeping, just tracing the outline of an absence that could never be filled. In those early weeks, people meant well. They brought casseroles and cards, told me to stay strong, and reminded me that she's in a better place. But nothing anyone said could soften the ache. Sometimes Jack and I sat together in silence, grief swirling between us like storm clouds. Other times we drifted apart, each trying to heal in our own way. I learned that even the strongest marriages can fracture under such weight. For a while, I blamed myself. Was there something I missed, something I should have done differently? That kind of thinking, I realize, is a trap so many grieving parents fall into. The truth is, pain finds everyone eventually. There's no way to outsmart loss or schedule sorrow for a more convenient time. I remembered Sharon's quiet strength and tried to hold on to that. The days passed slowly, but I learned to let kindness in, whether it came as a warm meal from a neighbor, a gentle text from an old friend, or simply a moment outside in the fresh air. Each small act reminded me that I wasn't completely alone, even if my heart felt broken beyond repair. Sometimes the lesson is not about avoiding sorrow, but learning how to sit with it, how to let it change you without letting it harden you. I learned to breathe through the waves, to let myself cry when I needed, and to accept help even when I wanted to withdraw. Loss makes life feel fragile, but it can also make every little joy seem brighter. As the weeks slipped by, I found myself searching for a way forward, not to forget Grace, but to carry her light with me. And that quiet search, as I would soon discover, would lead me to places I never expected. In the weeks after Grace's passing, the world felt strangely quiet. I expected the phone to ring, the front door to open with arms ready to hold me. Instead, the house echoed with silence. My mother, Linda, who once promised to fly in if I ever needed her, sent a short message. She wrote, "I think it's best if we give you space, honey. Grief is so personal." My younger sister, Sophie, texted a picture from a friend's engagement party, her smile bright, her life untouched by loss. The funeral came and went. The seats reserved for my family remained empty, while a handful of neighbors and Jack's cousins sat quietly in the back row. I told myself maybe they were too heartbroken to come, or perhaps they didn't know what to say. But the truth, which landed slowly and painfully, was that not everyone is capable of facing someone else's grief. Sometimes even family steps back when the pain feels too big or too inconvenient. I heard from friends and support groups that this happens more than we like to admit. One woman told me her brother skipped her daughter's memorial for a weekend golf trip. Another said her parents stopped calling entirely, as if her sorrow was contagious. Jack too grieved in his own way. At first we leaned on each other, but as the days stretched on, he buried himself in work. We became like two boats on the same stormy sea, each trying not to capsize, but drifting further apart. Some nights I wanted to reach out to ask for comfort, but the words caught in my throat. I feared that if I spoke my pain aloud, it would become too real, too permanent. Instead, we sat together in silence, wishing things could go back to how they were. In those moments, I realized how easy it is to feel invisible in your own family. Grief can be isolating enough, but when those you love most step away, the loneliness sharpens. I remembered my childhood, the times I tried to win my mother's attention, bringing home good grades, making her breakfast on Mother's Day, always feeling like I was almost but never quite enough. Those old wounds flared up, merging with the ache of losing Grace. It became clear that sometimes, losing someone you love can reopen every wound you thought you'd healed. It would be easy to let that pain turn into bitterness, to build walls and push everyone away. I saw how some people after loss become closed off, unwilling to trust again. But I also remembered the stories from my support group, women who had rebuilt their lives not because they stopped hurting, but because they refused to let their pain define them. One mother, whose son had died years before, told me the world will not always give you the comfort you deserve. Sometimes you have to find it for yourself or build it for others. That lesson stayed with me. As the first months without Grace slipped by, I began to realize that I needed to create my own safe space, a place where my grief could be seen and held, not ignored. It wouldn't happen overnight, but it was a start. I didn't know it then, but the first steps I took toward healing, toward choosing connection over bitterness, would set me on a new path, one that would honor Grace's memory in ways I'd never imagined. The weeks turned into months, and I found myself drifting through familiar memories with new eyes. Childhood recollections resurfaced, birthday cakes, forgotten school awards, overlooked quiet moments with my mother always tinged by her hurry to praise Sophie, my younger sister. Grief, I discovered, doesn't just carve new scars, it can reveal the ones you never wanted to admit were there. Each empty call from my mother, each photo Sophie posted online, stirred up a storm of old insecurities. I had always tried to earn my family's affection, certain that if I did enough, I'd finally be seen. Now, after losing Grace, I felt even more invisible. It's strange how loss can magnify every unresolved ache. One morning, I scrolled through social media and saw my family laughing at a cousin's barbecue. Their smiles felt like salt in a wound. I thought of all the times I'd begged for their approval and how easily they seemed to move on without me. In therapy, my counselor asked me to name what I needed most from my family. The answer surprised me, just to be chosen. I realized then that so much of my hurt wasn't just about losing Grace, it was about never feeling like I belonged. I started attending a support group for grieving parents. At first, I was nervous. What if my pain was too heavy for strangers? But each week I listened to mothers and fathers who'd walk through their own storms. One woman, Denise, shared about losing her teenage son in a car accident. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were strong. She told us how her family, too, had quietly withdrawn, unable to handle her grief. Sometimes, she said, family can't go where your pain takes you. That doesn't mean you have to go alone. Her words sank deep into my bones. Jack was supportive, but even he struggled to understand the full weight I carried. We talked more openly after I started group therapy. Some nights we'd sit together on the porch, letting the silence say what words couldn't. I told him about my childhood, about the longing to be chosen, and he listened without trying to fix me. In those moments, I saw how healing can begin not with answers, but with gentle presence. Jack's willingness to sit with my pain without judgment became an anchor when the days felt unsteady. A small lesson began to take shape. Healing is not about erasing old wounds, but learning to live alongside them. I realized I had spent most of my life chasing validation from people unable or unwilling to give it. Now I had a choice. I could keep reaching for their approval, or I could accept that my worth was never meant to be measured by their attention. Denise's story and the stories of others in my group reminded me that sometimes the family we need is the one we find, not the one we're born into. As winter melted into spring, I felt a slow, fragile hope growing inside me. Grace's absence would always be part of my story, but so would the strength I was discovering in myself and in this newfound community. I began to wonder what it might look like to build a space for others like me. A haven for parents carrying invisible grief. That gentle, persistent idea would soon blossom into something much bigger, something that would honor Grace in ways my old wounds never could. Little by little, I discovered that healing often begins in the quietest places. My days settled into a gentle rhythm, simple routines that tethered me to the present. I'd walk in the park breathing in the scent of fresh grass, letting the world move at its own pace. Sometimes I wrote letters to Grace, telling her about the clouds or a silly bird Jack and I watched from our window. The act of writing, putting words to feelings too heavy to speak, became a lifeline. I started a small blog sharing fragments of my story with no real expectation anyone would read it. To my surprise, messages started coming in. Strangers, mostly mothers, wrote to say they understood the ache of empty arms and unspoken dreams. One woman, Helen, wrote about losing her daughter to leukemia and how alone she'd felt at every step. She thanked me for giving grief a voice, for daring to speak out loud what so many hold quietly inside. I realized then that there's a kind of magic in shared vulnerability. Each story that reached me felt like a thread weaving a tapestry of hope from so much sorrow. Inspired by these connections, I dreamed of something more than words on a screen. I imagined a space, a real haven for parents, walking the long road of loss. It didn't have to be grand or polished, just a place where grief could be held gently, where no one had to pretend to be over it. I researched nonprofit organizations, grant applications, and community partnerships, learning as I went. Sometimes I made mistakes missing a deadline, feeling overwhelmed by paperwork, but each setback taught me something new about perseverance and patience. Jack watched as my idea blossomed. At first, he worried that pouring myself into this project might reopen wounds, but he saw how purpose seemed to soften the edges of my grief. On weekends, we would brainstorm together, sketching plans on the kitchen table between cups of coffee and tears. It wasn't easy. There were days I wanted to give up, especially when the numbers didn't add up or doubts crept in. But every message from a parent, every thank you, every story reminded me why I'd started. One lesson became clear: pain doesn't have to be wasted. It can be the soil where something beautiful grows if we let it. By stepping out of my isolation and reaching for others, I found strength I didn't know I had. Helen, the mother who'd first written to me, became one of my biggest supporters. She offered to help organize support circles and even hosted our first fundraising dinner in her backyard. Our little group laughed and cried together, honoring the children we missed and the courage it took simply to show up. As the seasons changed, my dream began to take shape: a nonprofit called Grace's Haven. What started as a few blog posts grew into virtual support sessions, resource guides, and a blossoming community. The ache of loss was still there, but now it shared space with gratitude and connection. I knew the journey was far from over, yet for the first time I sensed that Grace's story and my own might just be a beginning, not an end. And soon, a surprise from the past would bring a new chapter, one I could never have planned for. Just as Grace's Haven began to bloom, a letter arrived that would change everything. At first I assumed it was another bill or charity request, but the elegant handwriting caught my eye. Inside was a formal notice from a law office I barely remembered. My great-aunt Ruby, my mother's aunt, had passed away quietly the year before. We weren't especially close, at least not in the way families usually are. But when I was a girl, she always seemed to notice me slipping me peppermint candies at reunions, asking about my favorite books, listening when no one else did. I hadn't known how much she'd remembered me too. The letter explained that Aunt Ruby had left me her estate, an old farmhouse outside town, a patch of wild gardens, and a modest savings account tucked away for something meaningful. For a moment, I just sat there stunned. It felt like a door opening when I'd almost given up on finding new beginnings. Jack hugged me, grinning, urging me to see this as a sign. But old doubts crept in. Did I deserve this? Was it right to accept such a gift when so much was still uncertain? I realized that just like with grief, sometimes good fortune feels too heavy to carry alone. Still, the possibilities swirled in my mind. What if this was the place Grace's Haven needed a real physical home for our growing community? I imagined turning the old farmhouse into a retreat, a space where parents could find peace among gardens and wide open skies. The idea filled me with hope but also fear. Was I strong enough to honor Aunt Ruby's trust? Could I turn her quiet legacy into something that would last for others, not just myself? To test the idea, I invited Helen and a few members of our support group out to see the property. We spent a Sunday afternoon wandering through overgrown fields and dusty rooms, laughing about creaky floors and dreaming up cozy corners for healing conversations. Helen, ever practical, pointed out which parts needed repairs first. Another Mother Priya offered to paint a mural in the entryway. As we planned together, I realized that this could be so much more than just a project. It could be a shared act of remembrance, a living tribute to all the children we carried in our hearts. One lesson became clear that day: sometimes the family that chooses you matters more than the one you're born into. Aunt Ruby had seen me when I felt invisible. Now I could see others who needed a place to belong. That sense of being chosen, of mattering to someone somewhere, was the thread that connected all of us. We didn't have to heal alone. The kindness passed down from one woman who noticed a lonely girl at family gatherings was about to ripple outward, changing lives in ways none of us could yet imagine. As we left the farmhouse at sunset, I felt the weight of both loss and gratitude resting gently on my shoulders. There was work to do, plenty of it, but also a sense of purpose that made the future feel possible again. What I didn't know was that this inheritance would soon test my courage and compassion in ways I never anticipated, especially when my old family and their buried wounds came back into view. As Grace's Haven settled into its new home, I felt a strength I hadn't known before. The farmhouse came alive with laughter, the smell of baking bread, and the gentle buzz of voices sharing heartache and hope. But as we painted walls and planted wildflowers, a letter arrived from my sister Sophie, forwarding an email chain from our family. They were planning a lavish family reunion at the very resort outside town, where our parents had celebrated every milestone, and more than once left me off the guest list. This time, Sophie wrote, "Would you be able to make it, Emily?" The words stung more than I expected. I found myself back in the old pattern of longing and doubt. Was I finally being included, or was this just a formality? The invitation came with a list of requirements: formal attire, RSVP deadlines, and even a menu request. Jack squeezed my hand, reminding me I didn't have to go if it would bring more pain than comfort. But I felt something shift. This time I was no longer the outsider desperate to be chosen. I had a community that cherished me, a new family who saw and valued every part of my journey. That realization brought both relief and courage. As fate would have it, a real estate newsletter landed in my inbox days later, advertising the very same resort as available for discreet purchase. The idea bloomed quietly. What if Grace's Haven could acquire it? Turning a symbol of my exclusion into one of welcome, I met with Helen and Priya, who encouraged me to pursue the opportunity. The board was nervous about such a big step, but the possibility of expanding our reach and honoring Grace and Aunt Ruby felt too powerful to ignore. After careful planning, we made an offer, and within weeks Grace's Haven owned the property. When the family sent out their official invites, I RSVP'd with a simple yes, knowing full well what they didn't. On the morning of the reunion, my parents Sophie and the rest of the family arrived at the resort's iron gates, only to find a new sign: private retreat event closed. I walked down the gravel path in a white summer dress, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. The staff, now friends, stood behind me. I gently explained that the venue was reserved for a healing retreat, not a reunion. For the first time, I watched my family struggle with the feeling of being left out. A lesson crystallized in that moment: sometimes the power to set boundaries is the greatest gift we can give ourselves. I wasn't acting out of vengeance. I was protecting the fragile peace I'd fought so hard to build. Priya, seeing my trembling hands afterward, hugged me tightly. "It takes courage to rewrite old stories," she whispered. That night, surrounded by Grace's Haven families, I felt the bittersweet freedom of having chosen my own circle, my own belonging. As the sun set behind the old resort, laughter and candlelight filled the air. I realized the story of my family wasn't over, but it was forever changed. And in the days that followed, I would need every ounce of this newfound strength for my family's return, would test not only my resolve, but my capacity for forgiveness and compassion. In the days following the retreat, word spread quietly through our extended family. At first, there was confusion: messages from cousins asking why the reunion had been canceled, followed by a wave of frustration from my mother and Sophie. The emails came in rapid succession, their tone shifting from disbelief to indignation. My mother wrote, "How could you do this? Emily, family is everything." But the words rang hollow after years of being left on the sidelines. I thought about all the moments I'd spent trying to earn a seat at their table, never realizing I could build my own. For a long time, confrontation terrified me. I hated the thought of conflict, of hurting anyone's feelings, even those who had hurt mine. But now I understood that setting boundaries wasn't about punishment. It was about healing. I replied to my mother as gently as I could. I needed to create a space where I and others could feel seen and supported. That's what Grace's Haven is for. Sophie called, her voice trembling with both anger and confusion. "You just shut us out. Don't you care about family at all?" The question lingered, but for the first time, I didn't feel guilty for choosing my own well-being. Our next board meeting at Grace's Haven was filled with nervous energy. Helen shared how her own family had struggled to accept her need for space after her daughter's death. Priya admitted she'd lost friends by standing up for her grief journey. These stories reminded me that boundaries are a universal need, not a sign of selfishness. Sometimes, Helen said, the only way to truly move forward is to let go of what keeps pulling you back. Her words echoed in my heart, confirming the lesson I was still learning: we are allowed to protect our healing. One evening, as I walked through the farmhouse garden, a mother named Yvonne approached me. She had attended every group session since Grace's Haven opened, rarely speaking, but always present. That night, she pressed a handwritten note into my palm. "Thank you for showing us we can say no," she whispered, eyes shining with tears. Her story, years of caring for others while neglecting herself, mirrored my own. I realized then that the impact of setting boundaries ripples outward. By standing up for myself, I was quietly granting others permission to do the same. As the summer faded, I felt the tension with my family slowly recede. They didn't apologize, but for the first time, I didn't need them to. I had carved out a space that honored both my pain and my hope, a space where Grace's memory lived on, not in silence, but in shared voices and outstretched hands. The loneliness that had once threatened to swallow me was replaced by community and purpose. Looking ahead, I knew the story wasn't finished. Old wounds take time to heal, and new challenges would surely come. But as I stood in the soft light of the garden surrounded by laughter and healing, I felt a quiet certainty. The foundation I'd built Grace's haven and the boundaries that protected it would carry me into the next chapter. And soon a surprising request from my family would test all that I had learned about forgiveness and letting go. It was late autumn when the unexpected letter arrived. At first I thought it was another thank you note, or maybe an invitation from a family I'd met through Grace's haven. But the envelope was stamped with my parents' attorney's name. Inside was a request for a meeting, not to reconnect, but to ask for help. My parents, who once seemed invincible in their suburban comfort, were facing mounting debt. The family home, the one where Sophie and I had grown up, was on the verge of foreclosure. In a twist I never saw coming, I learned the deed had quietly been placed in my name. Years ago, a tax maneuver my father never bothered to mention. Sitting with the knowledge that the home was legally mine, I was flooded with conflicting emotions. There was a part of me that wanted to turn away to shield myself from old wounds and new responsibilities alike. But the voices of Grace's haven echoed in my mind. I remembered stories of broken families, of people reaching out for help, and the times when someone's act of kindness made all the difference. I realized I had a choice. I could use this moment to close the door forever, or I could choose a different legacy, one built on compassion, not bitterness. I invited my parents and Sophie to my office at Grace's haven. The meeting was awkward and formal. My mother wore sunglasses indoors, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard. My father's hands trembled as he spoke. Sophie for once didn't interrupt or try to fill the silence. I listened as they explained their circumstances, failed investments, mounting bills, and the slow unraveling of a lifestyle that had always looked perfect from the outside. When they finished, I slid a piece of paper across the table. "This is a deed transfer," I explained, "but not the kind you expect." My decision was simple but not easy. The house, I told them, would not be returned to them, nor sold to save their old life. Instead, it would become the new headquarters for Grace's haven, a place for grieving families, a home for those who had nowhere else to turn. I offered them the chance to attend the ribbon-cutting ceremony, not as owners, but as guests. There were tears, real ones, and for the first time I saw my parents not as distant figures, but as people wrestling with regret and uncertainty. The lesson was clear: forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past or pretending that pain never existed. It's about choosing not to let that pain define you or dictate your future. By letting go of resentment, I made space for something more, a legacy of healing, not just for myself, but for everyone who might walk through those doors. Sophie squeezed my hand as they left, and in that quiet gesture, I sensed a shift. Maybe, just maybe, some wounds can start to close. As winter settled in, I stood on the porch of the old house, breathing in the cold night air. There was sadness, but there was also hope. The story that began with so much loss was about to find its final unexpected note, a celebration of all the ways we can turn pain into purpose and loneliness into belonging. On a crisp winter morning, Grace's haven opened its doors in the home where my childhood memories once lived. The house was filled with laughter, the smell of cinnamon rolls, and the soft hum of conversation. Parents from every chapter of my journey wandered through sunlit rooms, pausing to admire murals painted with hope. In that moment, I saw how every piece of my story, each loss, every boundary set, each act of forgiveness had brought us all here. The sorrow that once threatened to consume me had been reshaped into a sanctuary of comfort, proof that even the deepest wounds can give rise to something beautiful. As the ribbon fluttered to the ground, I looked around and recognized familiar faces, Jack by my side, Helen and Priya helping children hang paper stars in Grace's memory, and even my parents quietly seated near the back. I realized then that family isn't always defined by blood or the memories we wish we'd had. Sometimes it's built from shared vulnerability, mutual respect, and the courage to start again. Grace's Haven became a home not just for me, but for everyone who needed a place to belong when the world felt too heavy. In the weeks that followed, stories poured in from near and far. Parents wrote to say that Grace's Haven gave them strength to face their own dark nights, and volunteers offered time and talents to expand our reach. Our small support group blossomed into a nationwide community connected by love and the lessons we learned together that pain does not have to isolate us, that setting boundaries is an act of self-respect, and that forgiveness can open doors to a future brighter than we once believed possible. Reflecting on this journey, I know Grace's spirit lives on not just in memory, but in every act of kindness that passes through these walls. I learned that it's okay to grieve, to ask for help, and to build a new story from the ashes of the old. If you've ever felt invisible, abandoned, or weighed down by heartbreak, please remember you are not alone and your voice matters. Sometimes the family you need is the one you create for yourself with open hands and an open heart. If this story touched you, I invite you to join our community. Like, comment, and subscribe to share your story or support others who may be struggling. Every voice adds light to our haven. Every story makes us stronger. Together we can transform pain into purpose and isolation into belonging, one courageous step at a time. Thank you for being a part of Grace's Haven. Your presence means more than you know.